course Solid Waste Management on fecal sludge emptying, treatment and disposal. I'm one of the authors of this paper, and Aubrey, who is joining us online, is also one of the authors of this. For over 10 years, we've seen fecal sludge management being a topic of discussion in the water and sanitation sector. And we've seen a spectrum of interventions implemented towards improved FSM service delivery along the sanitation service chain. And we can speak of one of the most recent interventions. Oh, we could go to the next one?
Yes.
One of the most recent interventions being the installation and operationalization of the 2 fecal sludge treatment plants at Manchinchi and also in Matero. However, we still see that the presence of solid waste is one of the biggest challenges in fecal sludge management projects and even just operations and maintenance. And this study brings together and puts to light these challenges and how it affects FSM service delivery. Next slide. It took on a case study approach, and it put together data that was collected from the Lusaka sanitation project as well as the climate-friendly sanitation project activities. So under the Lusaka sanitation project, the data that was used was from 10,003 knowledge and attitude practice surveys that were conducted in 3 target areas, namely Chazanga, Chawama, and George. And this was capturing data on household on-site sanitation facilities as well as the solid waste management practices. The CFS project activities sought to experiment and test 3 pit emptying technologies. That's the GALPA, the FlexX, as well as the EVAC or MK3 technologies against the commonly used garden modified tools. And additionally, another one of the activities that summed up this research was solid waste being measured from pits that were scheduled to be emptied during that period. So the solid waste was taken, washed, allowed to dry, and then weighed. And from these 3 communities, we see that there are different predominant practices of solid waste management at the household level, and these are shown in the table that we see before us. We see that there's burning on the premises, there's burying, there's also disposal in the pits, and these vary depending on the service delivery that is offered within the communities. We see that in George, there's quite a high activity of waste collection, but in the other 2, not so much. And for that, we sum it up or give an average of about 30% of the solid waste from all these communities being put in the pit latrines as well as the septic tanks because of these areas lacking service delivery for solid waste management. Also, during this survey, the data was reported that about 1%, regardless of whether there's service or not, always ends up in these sanitation services, or sanitation facilities rather. When we speak of it at the capture and storage, we can relate this now to how the solid waste finds its way at each point within the service chain. So the results show these effects of solid waste at each point. And at capture storage, with 80% of the facilities being pit latrines throughout the 3 target areas, on average, the study revealed that 150 kg of solid waste is found within these pits per cubic meter of fecal sludge that is emptied. At emptying and transportation, the effects of solid waste are equally numerous. It starts from an increased emptying time for the pit emptying service because these emptiers have to navigate through the solid waste that they find within the pits. Also, the technologies that were tested during the CFS project failed because of clogging. Every time that they would attempt to empty a pit, it would have to be interrupted because of the solid waste presence within the pits. And also compromising of the sanitation facilities infrastructure. So the pits would have to be punctured on the side for them to access the fecal sludge, which affects the integrity of the overall structure of the pit latrines or of the sanitation facilities. When we look at it from the treatment and use and disposal point, the treatment plants are affected by solid waste in the sense that more personnel is required at these treatment plants to specifically deal with solid waste. That is, removing it from the screens, washing it, ensuring that it's laid well to dry, and then also putting it in the right place for disposal purposes. And that directly relates to the amount of time that is spent conducting operational activities. And also, solid waste disposal costs consume up to 5% of the overall income at the treatment plant. And from all this, there are certain lessons that we learned and picked out that would be of cardinal interest in this particular meeting. First, that where there's no service delivery for solid waste management, the solid waste is inevitably going to end up in the sanitation facility. And also that a difference between the types of solid waste that are found in the different types of sanitation facilities. For the flush toilets, most of the solid waste that was found is menstrual hygiene products. Also that O&M of these facilities, in terms of emptying, is something that is required quite frequently, because in these three communities, the pits fill up very quickly. And lastly, that there's a high risk of contamination for the operators during emptying and treatment process. Next. And so the recommendations from these insights are that, number one, solid waste management needs to be addressed at the household level. Different approaches can be used for this particular type of address. For example, awareness raising, campaigns, and so on. But this also has to happen in parallel with service delivery. So not only does this advocacy arm need to be in place, but also service delivery needs to happen for them to have options, for the households to have options on where this solid waste should go. Sanitation facilities, as well as a recommendation that prevent solid waste being put in them, are highly recommended during implementation. And such an example is the small bore pans. So it doesn't allow as much solid waste to go in, and so it prevents the user, which is the household, from putting the solid waste in the pits. All right, and of course, holding all these recommendations together, which is something I see has already been discussed at the beginning of this meeting, is the regulations and the standards that would actually govern this particular intervention or this particular recommendation. And of course, backed up with robust enforcement systems. And finally, as we sit here as cooperating partners, that solid waste is something that is strongly considered and factored in during project planning and implementation to ensure that the element of solid waste is understood and also budgeted in for implementation of OSS and FSM related projects. Okay, I'm very grateful, the next slide, is the end slide, that you took the time to listen to these insights. The link below is directing us to the broad